wanting to thank the Free State Project for inviting me to talk here, and thanks to all of you, especially those who aren't familiar with what I do, for keeping an open mind, I hope. And I understand from the Facebook announcement of this event that a lot of people did take offense at the name, the title of this talk, and I really understand why they would. I just want to say I provided the organizers about a half dozen possible titles, and they seem to have settled on the most controversial one. Other people commenting in the Facebook thread expressed outrage at the very idea of anti-feminism. They seem to think that anti-feminism is some kind of objection to the idea of strong women. And another accused me of being a wealthy, educated, bourgeois white woman. Yay! Before I start, I'm going to clear up some of those misconceptions. I am not, in fact, wealthy or even formally educated. I am working class from a solid working class background. And I'm also not opposed in any way, shape, or form to the idea of a strong woman. My grandmother kicked butt and took names in her day, at home and at a full-time job as postmistress of her town, and she would be rolling over in her grave if she thought that I believed that. So why am I an anti-feminist? First and foremost, it's because I believe feminism as an ideology, a political movement, and a branch of academia is misguided at best, dishonest at worst. Whatever the case may be, whether it's maybe some of column A and a little of column B, scholarly and political feminism has shown a consistent imperviousness to facts and empiricism. Secondly, it's because feminism's influence on law and public policy has caused a huge amount of damage to men, children, and even women, almost entirely in the service of imposing a unilateral collective blame on men for the world's problems, especially women's problems. And it's generated and exacerbated a conflict between the sexes that simply never needed to exist. Some of you might be asking, what's an anti-feminist doing speaking at a libertarian forum? What does gender politics have to do with libertarian philosophies? And the answer to that question is kind of complex. For one, gender influences everything, including the size, scope, and decisions of government. On the micro scale, gender affects the way men and women think, how they feel, how they process their interactions with the world, what motivates them, what influences them, what's important to them, and what incentives are going to affect their behavior and how they will be affected. And it affects how we perceive other people depending on whether they're a man or a woman. It impacts what we feel is appropriate regarding the behaviors, responsibilities, and roles we expect of others, and what we feel is appropriate for ourselves. On the macro scale, gender affects the way society feels about people depending on whether they're male or female, what expectations society has on them, of them, and what obligations society is prepared to place on them. It influences whose voices are going to be trusted on what issues and in what situations, and it affects society's willingness to punish or forgive. Who society is interested in holding responsible and accountable for wrongs done, who society is prepared to devote resources to help and protect, and who society is prepared to cut loose. So gender is a kind of shortcut people, societies, and governments use when they're sorting priorities. Who's deserving of help, protection, and support, socially, legally, and governmentally, and who's less deserving or not deserving at all. How should that help be implemented? How should it not? How much are we willing to spend? How much institutional power is government going to have to influence the lives and involve itself in the lives of its citizens to provide that help, support, and protection? And these prejudices are so deeply instilled in most of us. They skew the way we see everything. We're seeing things through a warped lens, but we're so used to it, we don't even see the distortion. And while much of this distortion is cultural in origin, recent research in neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and psychology suggests that these prejudices are, at least to a significant degree, part of our human biological heritage, which is probably why it feels so natural to us. And while feminism claims to have worked really hard to dismantle all of these individual and society-wide assumptions about men and women, if you scratch the surface of their ideologies and their efforts, what you will find is all of those assumptions dialed up to 11. Not only has feminist activism manipulated and exploited all of these age-old perceptions about gender for political, legal, economic, and social gain, it's only amplified them within the culture. As for why I'm here hoping to convince libertarians to think about feminism from a different angle, As well as being more open-minded than most people, and even, might I say, skeptical and contrarian regarding the status quo, libertarianism is not just about individual liberties. It's also about individual responsibilities, and more than a few libertarian-leaning people that I know have wised up on their own to feminism's habit of lobbying for ever more rights and freedoms for women while simultaneously attempting to divest women of the co-requisites, responsibility and accountability. While some self-identified feminists may indeed consider themselves libertarians, and they might even be genuinely so, the foundation of feminist thought is Marxist in nature. And just as Marxism long ago gave up on the idea of a full-bore revolution in favor of a more subtle approach called cultural Marxism, feminism has employed this technique to gradually colonize all institutions in our society while never, ever having to lift up a single pitchfork. I'm not going to bore you with a detailed history of the marriage of feminism and Marxism. For that, I will quote feminist Catherine McKinnon, who said, "Feminism, socialism, and communism are one and the same. Socialist communist government is the goal of feminism." I'll also refer any who are interested to a lengthy but fascinating lecture by Soviet expatriate Valdas Analauskas, who describes a courtship between Marxism and feminism that began in the mid-1800s. And I will note as well that the rhetoric about women's position in society expressed in the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls in the 1850s mirrored almost exactly that expressed in the writings of many communists of that era. The only significant difference was that it was men rather than the wealthy elites who were cast as the universal villain. It is a Marxist rhetoric of class oppression in which women are the proletariat, exploited and subjugated by their fathers, husbands, brothers, and even sons, the way workers were allegedly exploited by the bourgeoisie. The entire conceptual model of the patriarchy is simply Marxism repurposed and applied to the relationship between the sexes. Men collectively as a class oppress women collectively as a class. The intellectual backlash against feminism that began within the Marxist community around the turn of the 20th century with E. Bellfort Bax and Robert Briffault, whose observations and grievances regarding feminism are still relevant and applicable today, was quashed through intimidation, censorship, and the skillful use of emotionally charged propaganda. Bax himself seemed bemused by the power of women within Marxism to convince people that up was actually down. For instance, that women were more harshly treated by the criminal justice system when all available empirical data demonstrated the exact opposite. Then again, humans have always been more emotionally reactive to harms, injuries, injustices, complaints, and perils affecting women, more likely to see women as nurturing, benign, kind, well-meaning, and deserving of protection. We have always been more likely to see men as strong, sturdy, capable of self-sufficiency, potent, and potentially threatening. And these perceptions inform our reactions when men suffer harms, injuries, injustices, and dangers, and when they dare to complain about them. Because of these near-universal perceptions of gender, when feminists pointed up at the top of society and showed us mostly men, we did not bother to direct our attention down to the bottom of society and see the mostly men there as well. We all saw a glass ceiling, but not a glass cellar, and that allowed feminists to convince us that all aspects of society, the formalized and the informal, were male-dominated, male-controlled, and that women as a class were essentially powerless and subjugated under this system. We were told that men in power acted primarily for the benefit of men, and that women were treated as second-class citizens rather than different citizens. We were told about the harms men do and the harms women endure, and accepted half the tale as the entire story. By the 1960s, when communist thought had become confined to a small pocket of what the mainstream mostly thought of as misguided weirdos, feminist thought, slapped together from the exact same bricks and mortar, became not only fashionable, but had spawned its own branches of academia and, sponsored and unwittingly enabled by governments, democratic governments across the West. Most of the model scholarly feminists developed and expanded on, the patriarchy and its sub-theories, are little more than post hoc rationalizations based on emotional reasoning, seriously questionable data gathering, and outright falsehoods, but easily swallowed by the well-meaning public because of the evidence that stands out most starkly to us, given our natural evolved views of gender. But consider Theodore Roosevelt's 1904 campaign to revive the whipping post as a punishment specifically for men who beat their wives. He claimed that such men were repugnant to any right-thinking person, and 30 lashes would not cause hunger or want to a woman the way imprisoning or fining the husband would. Contrast that with what feminists of the second wave told us about domestic violence against women being considered socially acceptable until they came along to show us all the light. Contrast it again with the axiomatic assumption required to consider the patriarchy a valid model, that men in power will act primarily for men's benefit to the detriment of women. Still, a lot of people believed their claims. Under second wave feminism, family was reinterpreted as an institution based on exploitation. Instead of all members working together for the benefit and shared success of all members, women were recast as powerless subordinates providing unreciprocated labor toward the raising of his children and the keeping of his house, never hers in any context. Labor that freed him to pursue economic and social power outside the home. It didn't matter that most men throughout history had little more access to economic and social power than most women, or that what power men achieved they were expected to share equitably with their families. Feminists were too busy pointing upwards at the congressmen, bank managers, and CEOs and crying injustice to show us the taxi drivers, garbage men, plumbers, loggers, fishermen, miners, construction workers, factory laborers, field workers, roughnecks, and janitors. They envied the power of history's generals and statesmen, but spared little thought for history's thousands of young foot soldiers dead in trenches. They were jealous of the self-determination that made an industrialist rich beyond dreaming, but when that same self-determination produced a different outcome for history's mostly male population of tramps, beggars, and hobos, that was invisible to them. They focused obsessively on the men above who dominated the top 1% of society and didn't even notice the men in the bottom 30. The 23-cent average apples to oranges annual wage gap is still, in their minds, the height of sexist injustice, but the greater than 93% workplace death gap? Meh, who cares? Traditional ways of providing for and protecting women that were absolutely necessary in the pre-industrial past were reinterpreted by feminism as male oppressors keeping women down all through history for men's benefit. Domestic violence, a social problem that has always been gender symmetrical, became synonymous with violence against women. A husband's historical right to conjugal relations with his wife was redefined as marital rape, while a wife's historical identical right, one that for centuries, if denied, was legal grounds for divorce and could even get a man excommunicated from his church, that part of history was quietly erased from modern scholarship. And as an interesting side note, a few years ago, a man in France was ordered by a judge to pay his ex-wife over $10,000 in punitive damages because he didn't give her enough sex during their marriage. Can any of you imagine the media outcry had a man even attempted to sue his ex-wife for not putting out enough for his liking while they were married? Can you imagine the code-red, apoplectic, spittle-flecked level of moral outrage that would have accompanied a verdict in his favor? The traditional obligation of a woman to defer to her husband's authority was redefined as oppression, but her husband's obligation to die in a trench to protect his country and family, or the legally enforceable obligation that he provide for her and their children all the material necessities of life, that became male privilege. And when enough people protested the hubris of that assertion, it became patriarchy hurts men too. Under the patriarchy, all men are supposedly privileged by their maleness and all women oppressed by their femaleness. And if men are, as a class, the privileged bourgeoisie, if men hold collective power over society, then all men are culpable for the oppression and exploitation of all women. That is how Marxist collectivism works. As far as radical feminists are concerned, the drastic technological and economic changes that occurred during the last century, medical advances that virtually eliminated deaths in childbirth and drastically reduced infant and child mortality rates, changes that rendered the workplace as safe and comfortable as your living room, safe and reliable birth control, industrialization, automation, prosperity, plenty, and an unprecedented level of individual security, most of it brought to us by men. None of this had anything to do with the gains women have more recently made. It can't have, because women were historically kept from succeeding in a man's world, not by biological reality, not by the difficult and harsh nature of the environment men frequently had to operate in, not by circumstance, but by male oppression. Even prior to all those changes, during a history in which a woman might spend half her adult life pregnant or nursing children, where most labor was grueling, dangerous, and simply beyond the physical capabilities of women, where life was often brutal and brief, and where men bore a legally enforceable obligation to provide for the material needs of all female family members, the fact that men bore the economic authority as well as the economic burdens of a family was defined as a system specifically designed to disempower women. According to the most radical feminists, your grandfathers and great-grandfathers were rapists and slave masters who exploited, subjugated, and violated the women who were nearest and dearest to them, their own mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters. According to them, under a patriarchy, all heterosexual sex is rape, because women as a class don't have the collective political power to be on an even footing with men, and therefore any consent a woman might give is given under duress. Using the model of patriarchy, every atrocity ever committed throughout all of history can be laid at the door of normalized masculinity. But every male-generated advance, calculus, alternating current, the telegraph, the transistor, radio, penicillin, the number system, hydroelectricity, microwaves, fiberglass, the theory of relativity, the periodic table, trigonometry, insulin, canned foods, vaccines, fire retardants, Teflon, wireless communications, the microchip, the birth control pill, and even tampons, is a result of men intentionally holding women back, keeping women down, refusing to allow women to achieve, and hogging all the power and the glory. You see how all that works. All the great evils of history, admittedly committed mostly by men, are evidence of men's oppressive natures. And all the great advances of civilization, because they were almost exclusively generated by men, are equally evidence of men's oppressive natures. Even the exceptional and wonderful things men have achieved and continue to achieve that have benefited all of us are not evidence that men embody anything good. In fact, they demonstrate the opposite, that women would have achieved such things if only men had not enslaved and oppressed them. This is what they believe. If it isn't, they're suffering from some serious cognitive dissonance, because the belief that the patriarchy exists as an unjust top-down sister of gender enforcement that oppresses women and privileges men kind of requires it. And patriarchy is the foundation of ideological feminism. I have even come across feminists who claim that women's experience through history is identical to the experience of blacks under slavery. But consider this. If women were truly oppressed by the patriarchy, would they have been spared the most onerous and dangerous tasks simply because they were less physically capable? Or would men have simply assigned more women to do them? Does anyone here think that women who were a tiny minority, 0.1% among the 10 million military personnel who died during World War I, derived no benefit from the traditional system? Heck, one of the few ways a man could avoid conscription was to be married. Simply put, a man could avoid mandatory military service if his wife would be inconvenienced by it. And yet this system existed to benefit men at the expense of women, a system of top-down oppression, according to many feminists, that is no different from the experience of blacks under slavery. If one does perceive the history of gender relations as being remotely like that, it's perfectly understandable that a feminist like Robin Morgan, former editor of Ms. Magazine, would claim man-hating is an honorable and viable political act. The oppressed have a right to class hatred against the class that is oppressing them. Yet as simple and childish and absurd as this model is, it wasn't long before it had become firmly entrenched in academia, in the humanities and the arts, in sociology, anthropology, political science, the law, psychology, history, women's studies, and gender studies. The very faculties and programs associated with education, social work, journalism, criminal and family law, and governance. The very branches of society most able to influence public opinion and perception and government policy. And because of all those things I was talking about at the very start of this presentation, public perception was vulnerable to the half-truths presented to it, disguised as the entire picture. And the really awesome thing about this model is that as long as enough people believe it, even just a little, as long as enough people can be convinced to see men as the bourgeoisie who have always unjustly benefited from their exploitation of women, and women as the proletariat who have always been forced to toil and slave without benefit under the boot heel of those privileged men, you can justify anything. It becomes acceptable, justifiable, and appropriate for women to expropriate men's undeserved and unearned power, wealth, and privilege by any means necessary, including state coercion. And this attitude is not just confined to family law, domestic violence law, and sexual assault law, the primary areas where men's interests will come into conflict with women's, and where feminist lobbyists in the state have been quietly at work eroding due process protections and equal treatment under the law, and building bloated and ravenous mechanisms that suck up dollars and power while curtailing civil liberties. It's everywhere. Think about the life of Julia. I'm sure you guys must be familiar with it. One of Obama's most naked and blatant appeals to young single women. Julia has no father and no husband. She needs neither. The state will take care of her needs from birth to death and will support her when she decides to have a child of her own, a child that in Obama's narrative is also fatherless. The man in Julia's life, the one who will perform the roles, provision, protection, and support, historically performed by husbands, brothers, and fathers, is more powerful than any man she'll ever meet, more able to provide for her, and one she need make no compromises with. He is the ultimate provider and the ultimate protector, and all he will ask of her in return is her vote. And he'll give her all those benefits through a system that coerces net taxpayers and net tax generators, of whom a disproportionate number are men, to surrender their productivity while offering them neither mutual benefit nor voluntary association in return. This feels right and just to feminists because the state is merely assisting Julia in stealing back all the opportunities that were wrongfully taken from women as a class by men as a class. This feels like a great deal for Julia, since all she's done is replace a man with whom she would have to bargain freely with a state that provides her all the same benefits without the messy business of having to trade anything valuable for them. If women like Julia can be said to be married to the state, in a very real sense, men are married to it as well, and the obligations expected of them are the same as they always have been. In this marriage, men pay at least 75% of the tax revenue into the system and reap a disproportionately tiny percentage of its protections and benefits. In this marriage, the state enforces the obligations of husbandhood after divorce and the obligations of fatherhood even when men did not consent to become fathers and even when they are allowed no meaningful role in the lives of their children. The state is essentially forcing men to finance a system that disenfranchises them, and the state is essentially paying women to disenfranchise men. Social responsibility is enforced on men through the penalty of imprisonment, while for women, social irresponsibility means a check in the mail every month. A lot of people have wondered out loud why there aren't more female libertarians. If there's a reason, it lies in a lack of incentive. Big government costs the vast majority of men their wealth, their civil liberties, their autonomy, sometimes their freedom. But for many women, big government represents an insurance policy and a perpetual subsidy of their personal choices, good or bad. Men pay the premiums into the plan, and women receive the benefits.